Hello, once again, this is Charles Bernard. I'm a professional paperback book cover illustrator, and I also founded the Online Art Academy, where you can learn the all-important fundamentals. In this video, I want to talk about parts to the whole. This is one of the most important art lessons you will ever learn. If you are a beginner, you begin your drawings and paintings without thinking about how one part relates to another. All art is about relating one thing to another. And you have to know how that is done. Just putting down shapes like this in any old way doesn't relate one part to another. What you end up with is a bunch of shapes that do not relate to each other. You have to relate one to another, and the only way you can do that is if you know how that is done. So if I draw a circle here, the next shape that I add needs to relate to that circle. There are different ways to do it, and in my Complete Illustration Art course, I talk about how to integrate the parts to the whole. Here, I'll give you a brief example. If I repeat this circle shape, this second part now relates to the first part. And why does it relate to the first part? Because it has the same shape. It's a circle, just like the first shape or part is a circle. I have a hole here. The two shapes together make a hole. And that hole is made up of two parts. And they relate to each other. In addition to that second shape having the same shape as the first shape, it also has the same value. There's a light value here, and there's a light value here. I'm going to darken the background so that these two light values show up better, like this. If I select the color, like red, and I apply red to this foreground circle, that circle shape now doesn't relate to this second circle shape in terms of color. It relates in terms of shape, but now also the value is different, because this red has a darker value than this value here. So right now, this circle shape in the back here is relating to the foreground shape only in terms of shape, not in terms of value or color. But as soon as I add, let's say, a color that is more of an orange, like this, now the two shapes relate in terms of color. And why? Because both colors contain red. There is red in orange, and then of course I have red in the first shape. This fact that the two shapes have a color in common is what relates one to the other. If I add the same red to the second shape that is on the first shape, again, the first shape relates to the second shape through color, just as it did when the color was orange. But now I have a red, so they still relate. I'm still thinking in terms of relating one shape to the next shape. The beginner doesn't think like this. And this is what you need to learn. This is the most important thing in art, is to create relationships. The great artist Matisse said, "I don't paint things, I paint relationships." That's what art is all about, painting relationships, not things. And the beginner paints or draws things, completely unaware of the fact that there has to exist this relationship between parts. You need to relate one part to the next. A painting or a drawing like this that contains a lot of shapes, a lot of parts. Think in terms of parts. Each part, this is a part, and this is a part, that head is a part, that is a part. Each part must relate to another part in some way. So if I add that red over here, I'm relating this shape to that shape in terms of color. So here is the whole. That's the whole. And then these shapes are parts of the whole, and each part must relate to every other part. That's how you need to think. And unfortunately, the beginner has no clue about the importance of this kind of relating of one thing to another, and the beginner just goes in there and starts drawing and tries to render some kind of image that is recognizable, focuses on getting the details, and there's no awareness of the fact that what is more important is whether this part relates to this part or that part. To keep things simple, I'm making simple shapes like this. So here are two shapes. They are part of a whole. This is the whole, and these are the parts. They relate to each other because they are both triangles. If I did something like this, these two shapes do not relate to each other because they're too different. But there is a connection between them because both shapes have this value that I'm going to give them. It's that value that is the same that connects these two shapes, that relates this shape to that one. Although the connection isn't very strong because there's only one property or dimension that has been repeated in each of these parts, which is this light value. I can strengthen the connection if I change that light value to a light color so that that color has the same value as the value that is there now. So if I add this orange color to both of these shapes like this, now there are two properties or dimensions that these two shapes share, which is value and color. Because they now have two properties that they share, value and color, the connection between these two opposing shapes is now strengthened. But if I want an even stronger connection, then what I do is I repeat the same shape, value, and color like I'm doing now. Here, the two shapes are both triangles. They both have the same value, and they both have the same color. Therefore, there is a strong connection between these shapes. One shape, or let's say one part, relates to another part. And because in this example, three properties are repeated rather than two properties in this example therefore has a stronger connection. They relate to each other more strongly than these two shapes do. But nevertheless, these two shapes still relate to each other, even though they oppose each other. So there is a unity formed here, in spite of the fact that there is opposition in terms of shapes. So you can have opposition or strong contrast within a whole, but still have unity as well. And here the unity is even stronger because of these three properties that this whole has in common. The more properties you repeat, the stronger the connection will be between the parts, and the more unified those parts will become. To keep things simple, I've just mentioned a few of the properties that these two parts of the whole have in common, as well as these two parts. But there are actually more properties that each of these parts of the whole have in common, which strengthens the alliance between these parts. So in addition to value, color, and shape, there is also size. These two shapes have a similar size. And because they are very similar in size, that further helps to relate one part or shape to the other. In addition, there's also saturation of color. Both of these orange colors have the same saturation. They are both a grade orange. And because they have the same saturation, that's another property then that further helps to tie these two shapes together to form a stronger alliance. The more properties that the parts or shapes have in common, the stronger the alliance that is formed, the stronger the connection. And that results in a strong unified whole. In addition, there's also the property of texture. Now this is a smooth texture that both of them have in common. It's not a rough texture. If I did something like this, where I added these little spots, that would then simulate a rough texture, and I'd add that on to the other shape as well. So now, both of these shapes have this rough texture in common that further ties them together, strengthens the alliance between the two parts even more. But even with the smooth texture, there is still a strong connection between the two parts. There's an affinity, in other words, between the parts here. In addition, a hue, which is the name of the color, and in this case, the name of the color here is orange. The hue has a temperature, and that temperature also is a property that these two shapes or parts share. They both have the same warm temperature. So temperature is another property that must be considered when relating one part to another. So you see there's a lot of properties that tie these two parts together and form a strong union, a strong alliance. And the same goes for these two opposing shapes here, with some differences, like I pointed out to you, because they both have different shapes. However, if I made this shape a little bit larger so that it appears a bit more similar in size to the circle shape, now these two shapes or parts have everything in common except their shapes that these two parts have that I mentioned. What I've implemented here with these parts are the principle of repetition. This is an important design principle that you'll be learning about in my complete illustration art course and how it is applied to paintings. Without a really good understanding of repetition and how to apply it, your paintings are going to lack unity. Now, it's not just repetition, it's also dominance that creates unity. So these are the things that you have to learn about and be able to apply to your paintings, or your paintings will never reach the professional level. They'll never be the kind of paintings that are going to get you work, that are going to get you into the galleries if you want to become a fine artist, or that are going to get you work as an illustrator or a concept artist. You have to be able to apply these things to your paintings. For without them, your work remains at the beginner level. So now you might be saying, well, that's all well and good here, but I want to paint pictures of actual objects, such as mountains and trees and people and spaceships and cars and all these other things. Well, you can't do any of that successfully without first learning how to relate two parts. What do you think the odds are going to be for you to be able to paint the entire picture that has a lot of parts to it if you can't even integrate two parts like this? That's why you have to first learn how to integrate two simple abstract shapes like this before you move on to more complicated parts. If you can't do this, you certainly can't paint an entire picture that has a multitude of parts to it. But if you're able to integrate just two simple shapes like this And that's what I've been doing. I've been integrating these shapes. If you can do that, then you'll be able to integrate all of the parts of a greater whole that consists of actual subject matter. So this is what you have to practice first. Just use 2 simple shapes, integrate them, then move on to, say 3 shapes. And then to 4 shapes. And here I'm adding a contrasting shape. And now the whole has become even greater. Now you have to relate all of these shapes, connect them all. And you might say, well, it's just a simple matter of repeating that same value and color and saturation and texture and size. Sure, you could do that. But unfortunately, if you're going to paint an actual subject and you keep repeating the same elements of design, and that's what these are, the elements of design, you're going to end up with a rather boring and monotonous looking painting. So you have to be able to introduce variation, differences in values, in color, in texture, in sizes, and still have them relate to each other to form a unified whole. I'm going to start off by doing this rough sketch. Now, when you place one shape down, like this, and then you're ready for the next shape, you have to relate that shape to the next shape. And then I'm going to add another shape, which I have to relate to those other shapes. What I'm doing is just the outlines to keep the shapes really simple. So here's another shape, and then another shape, and then back here I'm going to add a large shape, and you can see that the contour has this wavy line to it, like this. And now I'll add another part to this part, and then another part with those irregular or wavy like lines, and then another shape in the foreground here like this. Each of these shapes needs to be thought of in terms of a part that is part of the whole, which is all of this. Each part needs to relate to another part, and this part needs to relate to that part, and this part needs to relate to that part. All of the parts need to relate to each other. Unfortunately, the beginner, being a beginner and just getting into all of this, hasn't really learned that the parts that he or she are putting down need to relate to each other, nor do they know how to relate one part to another. But now, with this video, I'm introducing you to how that is done. Unfortunately, there's a lot more that you need to learn to really understand this at a deeper level and be able to apply all of those other things that I can't tell you in just one video. And those other things involve how to create these kind of variations and still achieve a harmonizing of all the parts. And that's what you're doing. You're harmonizing all the parts into a greater whole that is a whole consisting of these harmony of parts. If I repeat a color, let's say I repeat this red, and what I'm doing, I'm repeating the value, the intensity, and the hue, and the temperature is being repeated. But it's the kind of repetition without variation. And I showed you that in those examples. But then I did introduce a different color. And by introducing a different color, that's where harmony comes in. Harmony is not achieved through repeating the same color, but through the introduction of a color that is slightly different. Harmony is the result of similarity. So let's say I add an orange color, like this. What I have now done is I've introduced harmony. This part relates to this part because, as I showed you with the simple example, both of these parts contain red. That's what they have in common. That's what connects them, that's what relates them. But I've also achieved harmony because the colors are not exactly the same. They are similar, but not the same. So thereby, what I'm doing when I'm doing this sort of thing, I'm harmonizing one part with another part. What I've done here is I've applied a design principle, which is the principle of design called harmony. The beginner needs to understand that it is harmony that must be applied to the parts. You have to end up with harmony. What the beginner also needs to understand, if you are a beginner watching this video, that there are different degrees of harmony. Some parts will be more harmonious with each other than other parts. But even if they contrast with each other, for example, in terms of hue, and I'm going to get a blue here and add that next to this red. Even if they contrast with each other in terms of hue, they nevertheless may repeat or have the same value in common. You see, now that I've turned this into a black and white, you can see that both the red and the blue have the same value. So in terms of value, they connect up with each other. They form an alliance. But in terms of hue, they don't, because the hues are too different. Also in terms of temperature, they don't connect up with each other. But the fact that they both have the same value, that enables these two to form an alliance, a connection. However, that connection or alliance isn't very strong because there aren't enough properties that these two have in common to form a strong alliance. Besides value, they do also have the intensity or saturation of color in common. In addition, there's also size that they have in common. Both of these have a similar size, which further helps to tie them together. But unfortunately, because of the strong hue contrast, there needs to be more than just these few properties that I mentioned that form a connection between these two hues. And the way I can strengthen this alliance and thereby strengthen the harmony between these two hues is by putting a little of the red color, which I just picked up, into the blue, and taking a little of the blue and putting that into the red that I just did now. Now there is a strong connection between the two, because a little of each color is seen within the other. They have colors in common with each other, and because of that, the harmony has been strengthened. Since each of the colors has colors in common with the other, there's blue in the red, there's red in the blue. This ties them together to create a strong alliance, even though there is strong hue contrast between them. However, the harmony between these two isn't as great as it would be if I added more red to the blue here, like this, turning it more toward a violet color. The violet color is right next to the red violets on the color wheel. If you're familiar with the color wheel, you'll know about this. Now there is a stronger harmony between the two. Although previously with this blue there is still harmony here, but it's not a very strong harmony. So by adding more red, turning that blue violet as it is toward a violet, now this violet is in a closer relationship to the red violet, because They are right next to each other on the color wheel. And you can feel and see that they are colors that seem to go together. Harmony is defined as lying between two extremes. One is monotony and the other is discord. Now, monotony refers to repetition. When you repeat the same element of design exactly the way it is, you end up with monotony. And that's what you see here with these reds that I've repeated. Discord refers to extreme contrast, like the blue that I had over here, contrasting with the red that I had there. Harmony falls between these extremes somewhere. Take a look up here. I wrote monotony and discord, and they are at the extreme ends. As I mentioned, harmony falls somewhere between these two. If there is more monotony, there's more harmony. If there's more discord, then there's less harmony. So there are different degrees of harmony. And harmony can only exist if an element that I put down, such as this color, has another element, such as another color, to relate to. So if I place another red over here, I now have monotony, because the same red in value and saturation has been repeated. Now, coming over here to the other side, if I take that red, place it over here, and now I add, let's say, this color down here, which is a violet, and I place that over here. Now the relationship between these two colors is more harmonious than these two here, which have more monotony. Harmony is the result of combining both discord and monotony. But in this example here, there is no harmony because no amount of discord or contrast has been added to this second element. So what I wind up with is repetition. And repetition, exact repetition, is monotonous. If I want these two elements, these two colors, to be in harmony, then I need to add a different color to one of these colors. If I want a strong harmony, then the color that I add needs to be very close to the color that is there already. And the color that is very close to that color is going to be a red-orange, since the color that is there now is red. And I'm going to select a red-orange here, move the slider up a little bit toward the orange, something like that, and then I'm going to add it over here. Now, there is a strong harmony here between these colors, because they are not all that different. There isn't a lot of contrast in terms of hue, value, and saturation between these two. Therefore, there's a strong harmony here. If I add more discord or contrast, let's say this orange here, which is actually a little more like a yellow-orange, now the harmony is still here, but it's no longer as harmonious as it was before when I had red-orange. This yellow-orange, which actually leans a bit more toward the orange, isn't as closely related to this red as the red-orange was. So I've introduced a bit more contrast or discord. I'm going to bring in the standard color wheel, as it's called. Here it is. And these two colors right there can be seen on the color wheel. So here is the orange color right there. And the red color is right there. So they're not next to each other. They're one color apart. The red-orange that I had there before is this color right there. And you can see that that color is right next to the red color here. So therefore, these two colors are more closely related to each other, and therefore they form a stronger harmony than these two. But they are still harmonious, and they still are rather strongly harmonious, but not as strongly harmonious as these two. So as you move further and further away from the red here on the color wheel, the less harmonious the color relationships are going to be. So if I select, let's say, the violet, now let's say the blue-violet, which actually I think I'm going to have to add a little more of this violet to that blue-violet to make it a little more like blue-violet. I think that's better. So if I select the blue-violet and the red here, now the harmony is not very strong. The harmony falls more toward this side, right there where the discord is. There's more discord in this relationship between this color and that color. So let me pick up those colors, and I'm going to add them over here, right there, you see? And then the blue-violet I'll add over here. So now the relationship between these two colors falls more on this side here, on the discord side. There's more discord between these two. That is more contrast of hue, because they are further apart on this color wheel. Within this relationship of these two colors, there is both monotony and discord. So where does monotony come in? Well, remember, monotony is about repetition, when you repeat an element of design. Within this relationship between these two colors, the element that has been repeated within this color is the red. Within blue-violet, which this color is, if you remember, there is red to be found. So red has been repeated within this color. However, there's also discord, because there is a greater amount of contrast of hue between these two colors than there would be if I selected this red-orange here and placed it over here like that. Now, the amount of discord or contrast is much less, and therefore the harmony is greater. So within this relationship, there also exists both monotony and discord, but to a much lesser degree in terms of discord. There's still red within this red-orange. So red has been repeated within this red-orange. So I'm applying monotony or repetition. But there's also contrast, which means there's also discord. But the discord isn't very strong. So now I end up with a more harmonious relationship of these parts. Remember, I'm talking about parts. You need to think in terms of parts. Think about these two colors as being part of a greater whole. Remember what I said about discord. Discord is extreme contrast, but there are different degrees of contrast. So when I'm talking about discord being applied to the relationship of parts, I'm talking about contrast and different degrees of contrast. There's less contrast and there's more contrast. So I'm not strictly referring to only extreme contrast when I'm talking about discord. I'm talking about varying degrees of contrast, as I've pointed out to you in this example. Here I've shown you how you can achieve greater or lesser harmony between colors. However, what I've shown you in terms of monotony and discord to achieve varying degrees of harmony also applies to all of the other elements of design, such as shape, value, texture, and direction. I can't show you examples of those things because the video would run too long. You can't learn everything you need to know from one video. The only way you're going to learn everything you need to know is by taking a course, an entire course, that will then cover all of these other things that I can't show you here in one video. But I have touched upon how you need to relate, or how one part can be related to another, with this example here, when I talked about shape in addition to color and saturation and value. But it goes further than what I've shown you here. You need to be able to juggle, in other words, all of these different elements of design and applying varying degrees of monotony and discord to those elements, so that the relationship of the parts then becomes either stronger or weaker. And what you're then doing is introducing variation, more variety, which creates more interest. But yet, each part will relate to another part, and you end up with a harmonious whole in spite of varying degrees of harmony or contrast within that whole. Let's say you want to introduce a more strong contrasting hue or color among these other parts of the whole. But you don't want that color to harmonize strongly with those other colors. So what you might want to do is add, let's say, a blue. Now this blue, as you can see, is quite different from the other colors. But nevertheless, just as in this case here, there are certain properties that this blue has in common with these other colors. And I'm going to turn this into black and white, and you can see that one of those properties is value. This value here is the same as that one, and the same as that one. Now let me get back to color. And the other property is that this blue has the same saturation or intensity of hue that these other colors have. So there are these two properties that the blue has in common with these other colors, except for the orange. The orange has a different value, but the value isn't so different that it doesn't harmonize with the blue. Harmony is the result of similarity. So if you have values that are similar, like this value and the value of the blue, they are in harmony. Now I'm going to move on. There's a lot more to be said about harmony and about all the other principles of design that you need to learn about and be able to apply to the parts of a whole. All of this that I've been talking about, this kind of harmony, needs to be applied to the parts, as I said. And all of the other things that I said, you have to keep in mind when you are adding a part to another part to another part and so on. You just can't go in there and start putting down different values, different colors, what you like. Oh, this color looks nice, so I'm going to add that green there, let's say. Or, yeah, this other color looks nice, the violet, and let me add that over here. And then what about the value? Well, I think I'm going to add a real dark one over here, like this. If you do that, you end up with a big mess. You don't end up with art. You end up with chaos. And chaos is not art. Art is man-made order. And what I've been talking about here achieves order in the picture. So you have to learn these rules, these principles, this way of painting a picture, if you ever hope to paint really great pictures. All great pictures, all great paintings have in them what I've been talking about so far. The artist knows about the importance of relating one part to another, to another, and to another. The artist knows what they are doing. They know how to relate these parts and get those relationships just right, just the way they want them. What I'm going to do is apply a highly saturated green to this foreground shape or part. Think in terms of parts of a whole. And then I'm going to go to the color picker and select a highly saturated blue, which I'm going to add to this part. And then I'll select highly saturated violet and apply it to this small part here. There isn't any harmony here between the highly saturated contrasting hues, such as the blue contrasts sharply in hue with the red. To bring these two into harmony, all I need to do is reduce their saturation so that they both have the same level of saturation or desaturation. So if I go to the color picker and I select a lower saturated blue, something like this, and apply it to that more highly saturated blue, reducing its saturation and graying it, and then I go to color picker and reduce the saturation of that red to about the same value that the blue has, like this. Now, even though they contrast sharply in terms of hue, they now harmonize because of me applying a lower saturated color to each of them and giving them the same value. Let me just check what the values look like by turning this into a black and white, and you can see that the values are the same, or almost the same. They're so close that it really doesn't matter. They're still now harmonizing. That's how you can bring two highly contrasting hues into a more harmonious relationship. And the same I can do for these two. I'll go to the color picker, select a more desaturated violet and add that here so it becomes a grayed violet. And then I'll go to the color picker and desaturate the green as well. Again, the values also need to be the same to achieve a stronger alliance between the colors. And I think that value is probably too light, so I'm going to darken it. Something like that, maybe. Let me just check the black and white. No, it has to be darkened even more. So when the colors have the same degree of lower saturation and the same value, even though they contrast sharply in terms of hue, they then harmonize. So that value is closer, but I'm going to change the hue just a little bit here. Let me just check the black and white. It has to be a little lighter. So these subtle adjustments need to be made until you get it just right. That's close enough. And then I'll do the same for the orange and the red. Desaturate them as well. And by desaturating all of the colors, graying all of them in other words, they are all brought into a closer relationship to each other. They begin to harmonize more. But the harmony isn't as strong as it would be if those hues were closer in hue to the other hues. and the same for the orange. So now I have a grayed orange here, and I think you can see that all of the colors seem to harmonize more now than they did before. Here's what it looked like before I neutralized all of those highly saturated colors. And in this version, there isn't that kind of harmony that you find in this version. I think you can see that these colors, even though some of them have a different hue, which contrasts strongly in terms of hue with the other colors, there is still a greater feeling here of harmony between all these colors than in this version. So if you want to harmonize colors that are highly saturated and that contrast sharply with each other, then you can harmonize them by graying all of them. So what I've shown you here is what I've been talking about, and that is if two or more parts or shapes of a whole have certain properties in common, or they share certain properties between them, they are then in harmony. They harmonize, in other words. And the properties that these two, for example, share are that they have the same value. Also, they are both grayed colors, and they also have a similar shape, which is this curving shape. And they also have the same smooth texture. So these various properties that they share, except for the hue, puts them in harmony. Not a very close harmony, but nevertheless, they are in harmony. Now what I just said goes for all of the parts here. So the more properties that the parts have in common or share, the stronger the harmony. The less they have in common, the less they share, the weaker the harmony, the more contrast there is. And now getting back to this drawing without the color, so that those light values can be seen better, I'm going to darken the background. Now you can see the light values on all of these parts, which ties all of them together because they all have that same light value, and they all have a similar shape, which further helps to tie them together. But I can strengthen the relationship between these parts even more if I do what I did to these shapes here. Let's say now you want to change the values of the parts. So what you do, you begin with one part, change the value of that part, but then when you change the value of another part, you have to think about what value is that other part going to be? How is it going to relate to the first part? Is it going to have the same value as the first part, or are you going to add a different value? So let's say you decide that this other part is going to be a different value, a darker value, like that. So now these two shapes, this one and that one, no longer have the same strong connection to each other that they did before. Because before I added those values, they both had the same light value, as well as a similar shape. So they had two properties that tied them together, but now there's only one property that ties them together, which is the similarity of shape, not through value, because the values are too different. So the connection has been lessened by doing this. And now when you move on to another shape, again, you need to relate that shape to the other shapes and other values. Is it going to be a similar value to this shape here? Or is it going to be a really dark value like that, which then would relate that shape to this darker shape here? So you have to think about how are you going to relate that next shape to the previous shape. And this sort of thing goes on for the entire painting. You have to compare one part to the other and how it relates to those other parts, just like I showed you here in this example. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a similar value back here to those other shapes, thereby tying them together through similar values. Some values can be a little bit darker, some a little bit lighter, as long as the values are similar enough so that they form a connection. And then this shape or part needs to relate to some other part. When the elements of design share some common property, such as the same values, the same colors, the same textures, similar sizes or the same sizes, that then integrates them, ties them together, forms a bond between them, which results in a strong unified whole, which keeps the composition from appearing as though it is falling apart. That's why unity is so important. It helps to hold everything together. That's why every part needs to be integrated in some way to every other part of the whole. When you see something in more simple and abstract terms like this, rather than in more realistic images that look much more complicated than these simple abstract shapes, then it's easier to understand what is being taught. And once you understand it in simple terms like what I'm showing you here, then it's much easier to apply what you've learned through these simple shapes to more complicated images and shapes. But if you don't understand it in simple terms like this, then you're certainly not going to be able to understand it in more complicated looking images and shapes. In this simple black and white example, I can go further and strengthen the alliance between these parts of the whole, and that is the whole, and you have to think in terms of the whole and the parts of the whole, and that those parts need to relate to each other in some way to form a strong union, strong bond between each other. There has to exist an affinity between all of the parts in some way. So, how can I strengthen this relationship between these parts? How can I form a stronger union, a stronger connection? Well, the way to do it is the way I showed you with these simple examples here. I can add color. Now the color that I add needs to be the same value as this value here. So let's see what color I can add here. Maybe a blue-green, something like this maybe, that has a similar value. So let's say adding this blue-green here. And I could add the blue-green on that dark foreground shape. Now that dark foreground shape doesn't relate in terms of its value to the other shapes. So the alliance between that foreground shape and the other shapes that have a lighter value is not very strong. But now it has been strengthened because this foreground shape now has the same color as these shapes here. So now it relates to these other shapes in terms of its color. So I've formed a connection between this foreground shape and these other shapes here. Whereas before, the only connection was in terms of shape. So the connection was very weak because there weren't enough properties that these shapes or parts had in common to form a stronger alliance between them. But now there is a stronger alliance. So both the shape as well as the color is what those parts now share in common, thereby forming a stronger alliance, stronger connection. And I can add a green to this shape as well. So I'll go to the color picker and add a blue-green. Again, it needs to be the same value. So something like this maybe. And I'm doing this really rough. Now, all of these parts have this blue-green hue in common, which helps to tie them all together, in addition to all of the other properties. Each part of a whole must not be thought of as a separate part, but as a part that relates to other parts. And you have to establish that relationship the way I've been showing you. The background here also must relate to this greater whole in some way. Right now, it doesn't relate to this greater whole. The value is different. It's much darker. So it can't integrate in terms of value with these parts here or the whole. And it can't integrate through color either, because this is a gray, a dark gray, and this is a blue-green color. Now I can integrate that background with this greater whole by giving it a blue-green color, like the blue-green on these parts. So what I'm going to do is go to the color picker and select a blue-green, something like that, a dark blue-green that's been grayed. Let's see what that looks like if I add it. Might be a little too dark. Go a little lighter. Something like that. Now that background integrates with the greater whole through its color. It has a blue-green hue, and so do these other parts here. Right now, the values are all very similar or the same, and the colors are all the same, which relates to what I've been describing here, where all the properties are the same and are repeated the same way, which doesn't make for a very interesting painting, because you need to introduce contrast, like in this example here, where this kind of contrast between these two shapes exists. But there also needs to be contrast not only in terms of shape, but also in terms of other elements of design, such as value and color and texture. Otherwise, you end up with a rather monotonous looking painting. But you first have to get this right before you move on to introducing complicated variations. Remember what I showed you with these two when I introduced a different color? That's where this variation comes in that I'm talking about. So let me select the color picker here and a color like I did before. I'll select a red, but the intensity or saturation of the red needs to be the same as the saturation of this orange color for there to be a stronger alliance between the two, stronger connection. So now I have variation of color or hue, but still there is a strong connection between these two shapes, even though they no longer have the same color. So this is what you also need to introduce into your paintings, but there's a lot to learn about these kind of variations that I just can't cover here in this one video. You have to watch those other videos that I have, which show you a lot more about this kind of parts to whole and integration and unity and dominance and all those other things that make up a really great painting. But here, at least I'm introducing you to this idea of parts needing to relate to each other and to the whole, and how to achieve that kind of relationship. Let's say I want to introduce variation over here. Well, instead of this blue-green everywhere, I could change that blue-green to a blue. But the blue that I add needs to have the same or similar saturation of color that these blue-green hues have, so that the connection or alliance remains strong. If I introduce a more saturated blue like this, then that blue doesn't form a strong alliance with these other colors because those other colors have a more desaturated color. So in order to keep a stronger alliance between this part and these other parts, even though I've varied the color here to a blue, I need to keep that saturation of the blue the same or very similar to the saturation of these other colors, the blue-green. When you're able to relate one part to another, like I've shown you, then you've achieved organization. In art, the relationship of elements is termed organization. The beginner has no clue about how organization is achieved. But in this video, I'm introducing you to how you can achieve organization. Strength in art comes through organization. Your pictures must have strength. So therefore, they need to be organized. And organization results from planning. So you have to plan this. You can't just jump in there haphazardly and put things down any old way and not think about how one part relates to another. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the color picker and select a blue-green that is lighter and more saturated. And then I'm going to apply that over here. So I'm thinking of how does this color relate to the others? Well, this is also a blue-green, just as this is a blue-green, but that one is of a much lower intensity or saturation. So there's still a link here between this color and this one. There's still a relationship there. They're not so different. They're basically the same hue, but the value and the saturation are different. So in terms of hue, they still connect one with the other. They still relate to each other, one with the other. But in terms of value, they don't, because this is a lighter value and this is a darker value. So while one property repeats within the other shape, the property of hue, another property, that of value, doesn't repeat within that shape or part. Within the painting, there are going to be varying degrees of alliance. Some parts will form a stronger alliance with each other, have a greater affinity towards each other than other parts. But they all must form some kind of alliance with each other, have some kind of connection, relate to each other. Otherwise, you end up with a bunch of disparate parts that don't go together. And when that happens, there is no unity. The painting doesn't hold together. It seems to come apart. The colors are all closely related in hue. There's blue-green. And what I can also do is introduce blue-violet, because blue-violet is still part of the blue family. The blue family consists of blue-green, blue, and blue-violet, because they all have blue in them. So if I want to introduce more variation into this whole that I've established, I can do that by adding a blue-violet. But that blue-violet needs to relate not just through one property to another part of the painting, that is, through color, but in order to achieve a stronger alliance, a stronger connection with other parts, then there should be another property or two other properties that also form an alliance with other parts, just like I showed you in this example here. So let's say I add that blue-violet over here, and I'm trying to get the same value, something like that, and also the same intensity or saturation. So I have to lower the saturation somewhat. So now I've introduced more variation, but this new color that I've added relates to this part and to that part, because these parts all contain blue and they all have the same saturation or level of intensity. This one I might have to reduce a little bit in its intensity, a little bit more, like that. That forms an even closer alliance now with these other parts. And I've introduced more variety, which makes for an even more interesting whole. This book, this figure, it's supposed to be a figure, and I'll be showing you the finished color sketch that I did. This is just an abstraction, as you can see, to simplify everything. But later I'm going to show you the actual painting that I did. And this shape of the book here needs to be tied in, or needs to relate to some other part. Right now it doesn't relate to any part. There are too many differences between this part and the other parts. So, for example, in this case, I need to decide how am I going to relate this shape to some other part. And I'm thinking of using this color, value, and saturation on this book here. That's what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be a book, as you'll see in the finished color sketch. So I'm going to pick up this color here in the foreground and add that to the book. So now there is a connection between this shape here and that one. And there is a strong alliance because there are three properties that these two shapes have in common. There's the value, the hue, and the saturation. And since hue also involves temperature, there's actually a fourth property, temperature as well. So it's those four properties that tie this shape to this one, relate that shape to the other one. So a relationship has been established. Now the hand over here also needs to relate to some other part. Now, right now it doesn't relate to anything. It's not tied into any other part. So what I could do is maybe tie that hand into this shape here. And the way I could do that is by picking up that color and adding it to the hand, like this. So now, these two shapes, they share certain properties, which ties them together, and an alliance is formed. They have an affinity toward each other. So their properties that they share is the same value. This is a light value, this is a light value. They share the same saturation of color, and they also share the same temperature of color. They also have similar shapes in common. Shapes are curving shapes. So there are several properties that these two parts or shapes have in common. And because of that, there's a strong alliance formed between these parts. Now it's time to show you a more realistic version of this rough diagrammatic sketch that I did in order to simplify things for you. But it's time to show you the more complicated version that also incorporates these things that I've shown you here. And here it is. Quite a difference, as you can see. But what I've shown you with these examples here is what you find within this painting. All the parts relate to each other in some way. Some stronger, some weaker, but they all relate to each other, forming a strong, unified whole. Thereby, the whole painting feels like it is hanging together and doesn't feel like it's going to fly apart or break up. And now I've come to the end of this video. If you are interested in learning more about what I've shown you in this video, which is just an introduction to this idea of relating one part to another to form a unified whole, then you might want to check out my complete illustration art course, in which I go into this even more than what you've seen here. You'll see additional examples, which is important for you to see in order to gain an even better understanding of all of this. But at least in this video, I've made you aware of the fact that you need to relate one part to another. Think of that part that you're painting or drawing, how it relates to the next part that you're adding to that whole, and how that's done. Thanks for watching, and so long.